Welcome to BBB's Accredited Business Webinar Series. Today we have Stacy Carroll, an advisor with Trakstar, presenting on 5 tips for better performance reviews. I see we still have quite a few people logging in, so we'll begin the webinar at 10:03. Welcome to BBB's Accredited Business Webinar Series. Today, Stacy Carroll, an advisor with Trakstar, will present 5 tips for better performance reviews. We're giving everybody a chance to log in. I still see that we have a couple last-minute people logging in, so we'll give them a chance. And I just wanted to also announce that we'll be live tweeting at BBB News for You. So if you would like to follow the conversation, we'll be live tweeting during the webinar. My name is Shauna Dutton, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to introduce you to our Accredited Business Webinar Series. The BBB series is designed to provide our accredited businesses with relevant Better Business topics. We are very excited to have Stacy Carroll with us today, an advisor from Trakstar. Stacy is a certified senior professional in human resources, as well as a certified compensation professional. In this webinar, she will discuss the 5 tips for improving your performance review process, or how to create one from scratch if you don't have one. The goal is to give you all the tools to make your performance reviews a less stressful process and one that is celebrated rather than dreaded at your organization. But before we get started, I'd like to just take a moment and review a couple housekeeping items. First, if you have questions, please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Simply type them into the box on the left side of your screen. If you're viewing along with others in your office, please designate a scribe to submit your group's questions and respond to polls or surveys. We plan to address questions towards the end of the presentation. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties, on the left side of your screen you should see a link for GoToWebinar's troubleshooting website and also a toll-free number to call and listen to the webinar over the phone. Please use them if you're having any trouble hearing the audio presentation. Also note that to resolve a problem of the slides not advancing automatically, please try exiting and re-entering the webinar. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the online archive will be available next week after the live version on our website at www.akorww.bbb.org/webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Stacy to get us started.
Thank you, Shauna, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this important topic where we're going to talk about the 5 best tips for better performance reviews. By way of introduction, I wanted to make one more introduction for today's webinar, and that is for the sponsor of this program. Trakstar is a leading provider of cloud-based performance appraisal software. and they are in the business of ensuring that organizations have the very best performance review process in place by providing better technologies. With that, I want to get started and talk real briefly about our agenda for today's presentation. In our presentation today, we'll be talking about the importance of feedback on engagement. In other words, why our performance review process is important to an organization. Then we'll talk about the 5 tips for better performance reviews. We'll talk about goals, specificity, discussion, feedback sandwich, and think numbers. Those are the kind of topics that we'll be addressing today. Then we'll talk about some best practices for managers who are engaged in the performance review process. And then we'll talk about some best practices for business owners or HR who may be overseeing the process. And finally, we'll leave some time for some question and answer to address any questions that you may have that have come out throughout the session or that you think of towards the end of the presentation. And feel free, as we're going throughout the presentation today, to type your question into the question box. We've got everybody on mute today because we have a large audience, but you can type your question into the question panel. And again, we'll save some time at the end of the presentation to address as many of those questions as possible. With that, we wanted to start today's webinar just with a short poll to find out from all of you how many of you are currently utilizing a formal performance review process. So we've launched the poll there. If you would, just take a minute and let us know, do you currently have a performance review process? There's a couple answers for yes and a couple answers for no. And it'll be really helpful to get a sense from all of you that are on the call, kind of where you are with your current performance review process. So we'll leave that up for just a minute and let all of you kind of log your votes, and then we'll display to the audience what the responses are. You know, this is such an interesting topic, and I think it's a particularly important topic for this time of year. Many people choose to make this the time of year as you begin to plan and plan your budgets and plan your goals for the new year. Many organizations use the fall as a kind of time to do the performance review process and to sit down with employees and kind of talk about what went well and potentially what other things need to be improved upon. And so we find that this topic is something that a lot of people are interested at this time of year. It looks like, Shauna, were we able to, there we go, great. So here are the poll results showing, and I don't know, Shauna, if you could do a quick recap. It's unfortunately a little too small on my screen.
Absolutely, I'd love to. It looks like we had 13% say yes, and it works great. Another 13% said yes, but it needs an overhaul. And 47%, so the majority of us said, no, we want to create one. Or 27% said, no, we aren't ready for that yet. So it sounds like this is the perfect webinar at the perfect time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And that's what I was hoping, is that many of you on this call today chose to attend because this is something that you're thinking about. And the very best option would be to start off by kind of putting some of these best practices in place so that you can really start with a strong program instead of trying to redo it. Now, that's not to say there's no hope for those of you who already have a program. We all know that everything can be a little bit better, and we hope that that today's session will give you some interesting, kind of takes on that. So I love this little Calvin and Hobbes quote. Resolutions can be substituted for performance management. So me, what are you implying? What do you think I need to change? Well, buddy, as far as I'm concerned, I'm the way I am. And we all know that you may have one or two of these employees in your organizations, but I think for the most part, what we have found, and certainly in the study of human resources, we have found that people do crave feedback from their managers and their bosses. They want to know how they're doing. And the reality is, hopefully, most of our employees are doing some things really great, and they also need some areas to improve upon. And I think that it's not a bad thing, and as organizations, we shouldn't shy too much away from giving that feedback, because while managers think employees don't want to hear it, most of the time employees will tell you that they enjoy receiving the feedback, even some of the critical stuff, if it's delivered in the right way, with the right tone and the right spirit to it. This quote is from a book called The Progress Principle, and this professor at Harvard Business School has been doing a lot of research on kind of employees and engagement. And there's a quote from the book that says, of all the things that contribute to a happy workday, the one thing that stands out from my research is making progress on meaningful work. Feeling like you are able to move forward on a daily basis engenders real joy. And so think about this for a minute. Most organizations should approach their performance review process as a process not to put in writing all the documentation they need to get rid of somebody, but instead think of the performance review process as that time to really help employees move forward on day-to-day tasks that may be giving them trouble, all the way up to kind of move forward in their life and their career. And when organizations are helping employees to move forward, we know from the research, and also just all of us know from our own experiences, that when you're in a job where you feel like you're making progress and you're being successful, that creates real joy, and it creates opportunities for you to feel engaged with your employer. So while this stuff may seem a little bit fluffy, at the end of the day, it really is the most important thing we can do to help our employees feel engaged with us. And when employees are engaged, they generally are better performers. And when they're better performers, they generally tend to feel more satisfaction in their work, and then they tend to stay with us and be more loyal. So this stuff is pretty important. It's pretty important to make sure that you have a process, and we would like to think that the process isn't just a once-a-year event, but instead a regular feedback loop. But the regular formal process is an important way to help ensure that your organization is being as successful as it can. So let's dive into the tips, because that's where we want to spend the majority of our time today. The tips are opportunities for us to talk about those things that certainly I have seen in working with a variety of different clients, and certainly Trakstar has seen in working with thousands of clients around performance management. So we pulled together kind of our favorite tips about the things that we know that people, look back on their program and say, oh, I wish I would have done it this way. And the first tip that we have is about goals, because performance management starts with goal setting. It doesn't end with goal setting. Too often we see organizations that decide that they're going to do a review for someone. Maybe it's after 90 days, maybe it's after 60 days, or maybe it's even after a year. But at that time they sit down with the employees and they develop some goals as a part of that process. But the reality is it's very difficult to review people's performance if we haven't set goals with them from the very beginning. So my challenge to all of you today is to make sure that your managers or leaders, or you yourself, if you are responsible for the employees in your organization, are establishing clear goals for your employees within 30 days of their hire date. And a good guideline to use is that you want to establish maybe 2 to 3 goals. If you have more goals than that, it gets far too complicated. The attention is drawn in too many different directions, and your employees can't focus on what's really important. Now, each goal may have a different set of sub-goals or sub-tasks, for a better explanation. In other words, the things you got to do to achieve the one goal. Because maybe one goal is for one of your employees to become proficient at the new point-of-sale system that you've installed. And that's their goal, is to become proficient at that. Well, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about how to make that goal better using the SMART framework, which some of you may be familiar with. But it's obvious that to achieve that goal, there's going to be a lot of sub-goals. Attend training, work with the system, study the manual. There may be a lot of things along the way to get to that goal, but at the end of the day, what we really want from people is to learn that new point-of-sale system. So that's just an example of a couple of guidelines about the first tip, which is good goal setting. Number one, all people should have goals within their first 30 days of hire, and that they have a good framework of about 2 to 3 goals to work on. You know, I worked for a wonderful organization, and my boss actually gave me a series of goals. So she had the 2 things she wanted me to accomplish in the first week. She had 1 more additional goal she wanted me to accomplish in my first 30 days. And then she had established 2 goals to achieve by my 90-day mark. And I can tell you that my experience, even as a person who talks about this stuff and lives this stuff, my experience as being that employee and knowing what my clear goals were for my 1 week, my 30 days, and my 90 days really empowered me to feel like I was getting off on the right foot. Now, I have to tell you that one of my first week goals was to meet with 5 people in the organization. She had pre-designed some lunch meetings. And that was my goal, was just to meet 5 people in the organization. So again, these goals don't always have to be big and gigantic, but they help to set the kind of stage for your employees. So that's something to think about if you currently aren't using goal setting as a part of your process in the beginning and instead using it at the end. Now, we all know that there's some important tips to make goals meaningful. And these slides are actually from a wonderful customer of Trakstar's, Meredith Wallace. And she put these slides together and was willing to share them with Trakstar and with all of you today as well. And I thought that these were some really good pointers about goals. Because, again, my goals that I gave you about learning the POS system, that's not necessarily the best goal that we can have for our employees. We always want to write goals in a way that are meaningful and that use the SMART framework, which we'll talk about in a minute. So let's talk about meaningful goals for a minute. Meaningful goals challenge and stretch the employee. So my goal about going to lunch with people my first week, not necessarily a challenge and stretch goal, but it was an important goal in helping me to understand what was important my first week. And it did lead to my more important goal. So my more important goal, my stretch goal, was by 90 days, in my role, I needed to establish a call ticketing system. So I was taking over a customer service function, and there was no way currently to track the requests that had come in or the resolutions that were, being dealt with. So that was a big challenge because I had to go out and figure out what options were out there. I had to understand the internal workings of the organization. I mean, it was a big deal to implement a brand new system. And as you can imagine, just choosing the system was only half the battle because then I had to worry about how everybody was using it and implement the system. So that was a good challenge or stretch goal for me. And it's important to remember that if we set goals too low, if we set that bar too low, then it's not going to be as rewarding to the employee. So let's make sure that we're stretching the capabilities of our employees, because when they achieve that, they feel really good about themselves. You always want to make sure your goals support the achievement of the wider objectives. So my goal of creating a call ticketing system related to the department goal of increasing customer satisfaction levels, which led to the division goal of retaining more of our current customers than we currently were today, which led to the corporate goal of better profitability. Because we all know that keeping current customers is often for companies far more profitable than trying to get new customers. So my goal was very closely aligned with goals all the way up the chain in the organizational structure. And you want to make sure the same thing is true of your employees. You don't want your employees' goals to be something unrelated to what the company, department, or division is trying to achieve. You want to follow the SMART framework, which again we're going to talk about in a minute in more detail. But SMART is a very specific way to make sure that your goals are going to be meaningful for you and the employee. And finally, goals are ideally outcome-focused, not activity-focused. So again, I keep going back to my example, but I just want to follow it through this analogy. My goal was not go research different call ticketing systems, right? That is an activity. That was part of what I had to do to reach my goal, but my goal was implement a new call ticketing system. And so it's really important when you think about your goals that you're thinking about what outcome you want, not just rewarding the activity. Another very classic example, for example, with sales teams, especially inside sales teams, is if you're expecting them to make a certain number of cold calls, or even outside sales reps, a certain number of meetings. That tends to focus on the activity, not the outcome. The outcome at the end of the day, for most salespeople, is we want them to make sales. And it's an important distinction between how your goals should be outcome-focused, even though you may have those subtasks of number of cold calls or number of visits that somebody needs to make that are based on activities, but ideally the goal that they're trying to accomplish is more sales. So that's just a slight nuance on that, but it's an important way to think about how it is outcome-focused, not activity-focused. So let's talk about the SMART framework, and again, many of you may be very familiar with this. It's been around for a long time. But the SMART framework for goal setting, I use it even to this day. I mean, I've been in HR for over 15 years, and I talk about this stuff all the time, and I teach managers about it, but I still, even when I'm writing my own goals, I kind of pull out this framework because it really does make a big difference. So let's go through it. Goals that are SMART, the S stands for specific. So you want to know the who, what, where, when, and why. You want to nail down as much as possible specificity in the goal. And the second element is measurable. And it is, what does success look like? How are the measures defined? How are you going to know when the goal has been achieved? Effective metrics are usually quantitative and objective because they're often, you want to know when you've achieved that goal and you want it to be as specific as possible. Now, that's not always possible. Sometimes they're more qualitative and subjective. But if you focus on trying to make them as quantitative and objective as possible, there's no question about when the goal has been achieved. The third point is that they're achievable. And so this is really important because we talked about earlier that you want the goal to stretch the employee, to maximize his or her capabilities. But if the goal is not achievable, if it is perceived as I'm never going to hit that goal, then goals are very unmotivating for people. So one of the things you may ask your employees is to define for you what they will need to achieve that goal. In other words, what additional resources do they require? Do they need additional training? Do they need a budget? And again, the answer may be that you can't provide those things, but what you're doing is you're asking the employee to basically commit to achieving the goal by having them tell you in advance if there's anything that's going to prevent them from reaching the goal. And that's a great way to have a dialogue with employees about whether the goal is achievable or not. R stands for relevant. So again, we talked about that a minute ago. We talked about the goal needs to be something that focuses in on what the individual's job is, but that should be linked to the division goals, and that should be linked to the department goals, or excuse me, the company goals overall. And timely. So what is the timeline for completing the goal? It's always important to have a specific deadline because otherwise an employee may be working on that goal into perpetuity. So if it's for that current review period, if it's for 90 days, you need to be very specific about when the goal is to be achieved. So let me give you a sample. This would be one if you have had a benefits person or an HR person in your organization. The ineffective goal would be something like keep benefit costs low. So we challenge you, HR person, office manager person, to go ahead and make sure you keep our benefit costs low. Well, that's not going to be a very effective goal. A more effective goal would be written like this. Work with the benefits broker to develop 3 different benefit choices for 2014 that will lower overall benefit costs by 5%. Present options to executive team 2 weeks in advance of the budget deadline. So we're giving a very specific timeline. We're giving a very specific goal. Your goal is to reduce benefit costs by 5%. You're asking them to present options because it may very well be that your organization wants your senior leadership team to make the ultimate decision, but you're telling them very clearly what's expected of them. So think about the SMART framework, and more importantly, think about including goal setting as an important first step in your performance review process, not a last step. So let's talk a little bit about tip number 2, be specific. So this is one of those common errors that we see a lot, both I see individually and Trakstar sees with their customers, is that people are not being specific enough with both their positive and their constructive feedback. When you're giving performance feedback, you want to give very specific examples. Now, the thing that's important about this is we don't want to use behavior words. So we don't want to use words like you're very lazy, you're very sloppy, you're disorganized, you're mean, you're unapproachable. These are the types of words that, number one, they're very hurtful for an employee because they label them in a certain way. You're lazy. Well, no, it's not that you're lazy, but what we're observing here is that when you're showing up for work tardy 2 and 3 times in a week, it gives the perception that you don't care about your work, and you also don't care about your coworkers who are waiting on shift to be relieved by you. So we're not labeling the person as lazy. We're not, same with disorganized, right? You're a very disorganized worker. Well, what does that mean? So instead saying, there's an opportunity for you to improve upon your organization level. Let me give you an example. Last week when I came to you because I needed a response for a customer and you weren't able to find the backup documentation through all your paperwork, that created a very bad scenario where I wasn't able to respond to a really upset customer in a timely framework. You're not labeling them as disorganized. You're not giving them a label as a person, but you're giving very specific examples of how that person's actions affected the organization. And the best way to do this is to keep a log throughout the year because, as we all know, the specificity goes away with life. I used to have a good friend who used to say, I don't remember that. I've slept since then, right? We can't keep everything in our head. So the best way to do this is, throughout the year, is to keep a log. Ask your employee to report major wins to you each week because sometimes actually what happens is it's really easy for us to remember the bad stuff. It's not as easy for us to remember the good stuff. So set up a process whereby you or your managers, whoever is responsible for this, ask employees to come in and tell you one win for the week. And bring it on a piece of paper, save that in an employee file, and it's a great way at the end of the year or at the end of 60 days or 90 days, whatever your review period is, to go back through, and it's a good reminder about the very specific things that happen. You can use that same log then as the manager to document instances of tardiness or maybe some issues that came up, and so that, again, by the time that you go to do the review, you have a full log of these very specific examples. The great news is with technology today, this is a lot easier. And again, obviously, I'm a big fan of Trakstar. I work with them because I really like their system. They make it easy for people to log in and use the technology to document performance, both the employee and the manager, all throughout the year. And so technology can be a wonderful thing for us because it can help us, especially if you have workers that are at their desk during the day, it's a great medium just to make sure that all that stuff is logged. And the final kind of tip I have on this point, because I hear this a lot. Managers are like, I just get so busy, I forget. I have good intentions, but it doesn't happen. I honestly do this personally myself. I schedule time on my calendar because, of course, I go wherever my calendar tells me to go in a day. I schedule time on my calendar, 30 minutes out of every week, to sit down and just document some performance issues about my employees. And I dedicate the time. I sit down, I recap as much as I can about the last few days or the last week, and I just write some specific examples, and then it's done. And it is the most amazing efficiency tip that I have because, again, once you go to write the reviews, then what you have is you have an opportunity to sit down there and talk with the employee about those specific instances. So let me give you some samples, and sometimes people find these to be helpful in doing training with their managers. So if this is something that'd be helpful, it helps to give managers examples. Oops, excuse me about that, didn't mean to jump ahead. So here's a sample of somebody who did something really, really well, using a lot of specificity. Sam, as I think back to what you've accomplished this year, I am amazed. When we hired you 11 months ago, I had no idea that you were going to be able to roll out the new product ahead of schedule and under budget. I didn't expect that all of our procedures around procurement would be documented and that you would receive such wonderful feedback from your team members. You have exceeded my expectations for performance this year. Think about if you are that Sam and you are receiving this feedback from your manager, how specific it is and how thoughtful it is. It gives very specific examples. It's not just like, oh, Sam, you're a fabulous employee. So I think that it's really, really important that you think about how important it is to be specific with your feedback. And that specificity, again, comes from that documentation that you've accumulated all throughout the year. So here's the flip side when you have to use the specificity with an employee that maybe isn't on their best behavior. Ben, I've been given feedback from various members of our internal team as well as external vendors that working with you is difficult because you give the impression that you aren't listening to others by interrupting people and speaking too quickly without listening to what others are saying. In addition, on the Collins project, your team member said you ended the brainstorming session early and assigned tasks without any input. So again, we're not saying to Ben, you're difficult to work with and nobody wants to work with you. What you're saying to Ben is you give the impression that you aren't listening to people. So we're not telling him what he's doing. We're not telling him what his motives are, but we're instead telling him how it's perceived. And that is an important distinction that will save a lot of fights with you. Because I guarantee you is that if this feedback went a little bit different, here's what Ben would say to you. First of all, he would say, well, who's saying that? It's not fair. You need to tell me who's saying that because it's not fair that you're giving me this feedback and you're not telling me who's saying it, right? That's number one. And if we didn't say this in a specific way, if we just said you're difficult to work with, he'd be like, I'm not difficult to work with. What are you talking about? That doesn't even make any sense. Joe and Betty and Sally, they all love working with me. What are you talking about? So the problem when we're not specific and we do it in the wrong way by labeling people instead of observing their behaviors is that we get a lot of defensiveness. So let me just address one point because even as I wrote this, I knew what question would come up, which is, who said that? Tell me who said that. You have to tell me who said that, otherwise it's not fair. The first thing that I want to point out is unless you're talking about a very specific situation that was so severe that you needed to bring it up in a performance review process, generally you're not going to ever use one bit of feedback from one person in a performance review. And again, there's exceptions when it was so severe. But generally, this can be, you can say back to Ben, well, in this particular case, about these specific behaviors, it was mentioned by more than one person. And it's not, when I hear this from more than one person, then I think it's important to bring up with you because it appears that there's a theme here. And then, again, bring it back to, and it's not so important here that we decide if that was your intention or not with your behavior. What's more important is that you understand how you are perceived by others. So you may really care about other people's feedback, you may really care about their ideas, but you are giving the impression that you don't by these certain behaviors. So getting them to focus not so much on who said it, but instead to focus on the pattern you see in the feedback from others. So tip number 3. So we've talked a lot about goal setting and we talked about specificity. Let's talk a little bit about engaging discussion. And I think, you know, it used to be the performance review process was a very one-sided thing. You sit down with the manager talks at you, you sign a piece of paper, and you walk away. And that's actually not a best tip for performance reviews in this day and age. The purpose of your performance review should be improvement. We want this to be all about getting better. It's not about documentation to fire somebody. That's a whole nother process. We want this to be about helping that employee to be the very best employee they can. And for that reason, what we are wanting people to do is engage with us. We want them to have a discussion with us. Now, that being said, I think it's important that you always state your expectations. It is very important that employees know what's expected of them, and it is well within the right of the boss or the business owner to set those expectations. So we're not going totally off, the crazy end here where we tell employees, set your goals and make them whatever you want, We're still stating our expectations. And then in the particular situation where we have a tough conversation with someone about a certain performance measure that they're not meeting up to, you want to ask the employee how they can improve. How is it that you can improve upon this situation, Ben? Because the thing that we know is that when you force a certain way of acting on somebody, they are resistant to it. But when they are engaged in the resolution, in other words, set out your expectations and set out what the current situation is, then we find that employees are more likely to be engaged in actually making sure that there is a solution. And as the manager or the person responsible for the performance review process, we want to make sure that we are offering suggestions and helping the person to figure out the solution, but not just simply saying, so you need to make sure that you are never tardy again, right? You were tardy 3 times last week. What is it that you can do to ensure that you're not tardy this week? What is it that you can do differently? Well, I suppose I could stop hitting snooze when my alarm goes off. That's a great solution. So can we commit to the fact that this next week you're not going to be tardy once, right? And that's a pretty simplistic example, but what it is it's not saying to the employee, you can't be tardy next week. It's instead saying, what can you do to ensure that you aren't going to be tardy again? So again, let me give you some samples, and again, these are sometimes helpful if you're working with managers and coaching them through how to kind of provide this discussion element. So Sam, we're going back to Sam, this wonderful employee. I think you are one of the key components of the future success of the company and helping us accomplish our goals in the future. I mean, first of all, that's just a powerful statement to say to somebody. You are one of our key components of success. I mean, I know how I would feel if my boss told me that. I am committed to helping you achieve the professional goals that you have for your career. Let's talk about where you'd like to be in the next couple of years in your career and how I can help you get there. So I'm not saying, Sam, I want you to be the senior project manager, and Sam, I want you to manage the, such and such project, and I want you to go take this class in project management skills. I'm not proposing the solution. I'm simply asking, Sam, what is it you want to do, and how can I help you get there? Now let's go on the flip side, because this is the side that's a little bit harder. We're going to talk to Ben again. Ben, I expect, so here's my expectations, that as the project manager, you have the respect of your team members. I also asked you to lead brainstorming sessions so that the group could come to consensus on how the project would be accomplished. What ideas do you have for making the situation better? So we're asking Ben to engage with us on what can be done to improve the situation. We're not saying to Ben, I'm going to come and observe your brainstorming sessions, and you can only end them when I give you the signal. That's going to take way too much time, and it's not going to be beneficial. We're instead asking Ben to talk with us about what Ben can do to make the situation better. And we can provide feedback. If Ben's going down a path that we feel like is not the right path, we can say, Ben, I fear that that will continue to be perceived as you leading the charge and not taking any input from others. So it's important that we provide feedback. We don't want to just let Ben set the course of action without our feedback, but it's important that we help Ben to reach the goal by engaging Ben in the discussion. All right, tip number 4, avoid the feedback sandwich. It is probably one of the most common, I don't want to call it errors, but it's one of the most common things that we see from people giving performance feedback. That is, they give a compliment, then they give criticism, and they give a compliment. And the reason that we do this, or at least my sort of educated guess about why we do this, is that a lot of managers have difficulty with confronting people. They're really concerned about how it's going to make that person feel, or maybe they know some things that are going on in that person's life personally and they feel bad. There's a lot of reasons why managers do it, but we have a lot of managers who are afraid to confront issues, and so they feel like if I tell you something good about yourself and then I give you a criticism and then I tell you something good, it softens the blow. But here's the thing, it's really, really, really not the most effective way to give feedback. And one of the reasons is that low performers tend to hear the positive stuff, and I'm stereotyping here now, but bear with me. Low performers tend to just hear the positive stuff, and the criticism gets lost, and they think I'm wonderful. They told me at the beginning, and they told me at the end, and they had all these wonderful things to say about me. And so the message about what needs to be improved gets lost. On the other hand, a lot of times, top performers, despite the fact that you started with positive and you ended with positive, are really fixating on that piece in the middle, the criticism. So what's really important, and keep in mind that what I'm talking about right now is that part of the process where you're documenting somebody's performance maybe for the whole year, the formal process of performance reviews. All along the year, I certainly hope your organizations are engaging in wonderful practices around feedback with employees. And every employee is going to have the sort of, things you want to talk about that they're doing great and things that they need to work on. So I'm not talking about all throughout the year. I'm not saying that all your top performers need to only hear positive things. But for that time of year where you're going to sit down and kind of formally document this person's performance, I think what you want to do is select a key message for the meeting. And maybe even coach, and if it's you doing performance reviews or your managers, coach people to think about even writing it out. What is the key message that you want this person to walk away from this discussion with? Key messages could be, we are lucky to have you. So that when that person is writing that review for that top performer, that key core message is resonating in everything they write. Again, this doesn't mean that you can't provide some of the feedback or the opportunities for growth that are needed, but you can do it with a tone of, we are so lucky to have you. You can also set a key message of, you're steps away from greatness. I see it in you. I know it's in you. I know you're capable, and I want to help you get there because I think you're on the verge of doing really wonderful things. And that's where you need someone to step up just a little bit because you know it's in them. You know they have the ability to do it, but for whatever reason, they're just not getting there. And so everything about your performance review should be about how you see greatness in them, but you know that it can be even better. Or the third key message might be for that employee that you're sitting down with that you've decided you know is capable of more. And you want the whole presentation, you can still say positive things about this person. The reason I'm spending so much time with you today is because I know what you're capable of. And these instances that have happened over the last few months, I do not believe are indicative of the performance that you're capable of. And so, again, there's a central theme all to your messaging about the whole performance review. So it's a little tip to think about when you're having your managers write their reviews. Have them avoid doing the compliment, criticism, compliment, and instead focus their comments everywhere on a key message that they have for that meeting. And as I mentioned before, this process really does work best if you have regular feedback, because all employees need regular feedback along the way. But it's important that when you're sitting down to review the process that you're doing that in a way. So this is a sample, and this is actually a screenshot from Trakstar's performance management software. That's all web-based, so you can access it from anywhere. But it's this idea that you can make little notes all the time where you are documenting what's going on so that you have record of all the little notes, all the little comments that are made throughout the year. And number one, those notes will help you in crafting your final performance review, but it also gives you the two places, one place to have all the specificity and all the little comments along the year, and then your formal performance review can instead focus on that sort of central theme that you want people to walk away with. All right, so let's talk numbers. And this is our final tip today, and this is my last thought to leave you with in terms of thinking about making the very best performance review process you can. Most employees are obsessed with their score, obsessed. And I hope some of you can relate to this because you've been through this process. The difference between whether I get a 3 or a 4 or a 4.2 versus a 4.6 really matters to employees. So you've got to keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're going to score your employees. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There's lots of advantages to using a numbering system versus using words. And you want to think about that and think about your employees and how important it is for them either to have words or to have numbers. No matter how you score your employees, the most important thing you need to do is think about standardizing your scoring across the organization. And what this comes down to is this comes down to a concept that some managers have this view that nobody deserves a 5. A 5 is not achievable in this company, right? And then other managers who will say things to you like, well, we're all 5s. What are you talking about? My team is working so hard that nobody on this team deserves less than a 5, right? And so when you have these different types of managers and yet you're all working under the same system, it creates issues. So the best thing that you can do is standardize your scoring by giving descriptions of those activities to your employees. So if you're going to have a 5, put in words what that 5 means, and then even give some examples around specific tasks. So a 5 means that you are beating your project deadlines, your projects are always on time, and there's no accidents. I'm just throwing out some examples here. But you're describing what a 5 means instead of just leaving it to the subjective decision of the manager. So think about standardize your scoring across the organization. A third bullet point here is consider a 4-point scale or a 3-point scale, even better, as opposed to a 5. What happens when you have a 5-point scale is almost everybody. 3 is probably going to be your minimum score. Almost everybody's going to be a 4, and there will be a couple of 5s. That's generally what happens no matter what type of organization you're in. And so you may have a 5-point scale, but first of all, you're not using all 5 points. The other reason for a 4-point scale is that it has no middle. And so it really forces your managers to put people kind of in on one side or the other. A 3-point scale I've seen used successfully in a couple of organizations that just say you're not meeting expectations, you're meeting expectations, or you're exceeding expectations. And so that's a great way to think about it too in terms of just being very simple and straightforward with that. So I think that it's really a good idea for you to think about your point scale if you're setting up a program from scratch and how you want to use that. If at all possible, disassociate compensation conversations from performance conversations. I've seen, and this is a real trend right now in human resources, is to do the performance conversations at a different time of year than you do compensation adjustments. The reason being is that if you do compensation adjustments at the same time, I guarantee you throughout the entire performance review process, the person's just thinking about, well, what does this mean for money? And so it's really important that your employees have the opportunity to focus on performance outside of money. Now, if you do it at the same time of year, and if you use your performance scores to dictate what kind of raise somebody gets, what I would encourage you to do is to tell the employees right up front, we're not going to be talking about money until the best case scenario would be we're not going to talk about money for another 2 weeks. because we're going to actually do everyone's performance reviews first, and then we're going to allocate the increases for the year so that the employee is not fixating on those dollars all throughout. If it is that you do it at the same time that you do the performance discussion, just simply tell the employee right up front, you know, one of two things. Either we're not going to talk about money until the end, so just keep that in mind. But again, that employee will probably still focus on the money. The other option is to give them the number right up front so that it's just out of their mind, and then spend the remaining time with them making sure that you are talking with them about why they got the increase that they did. And also use performance review scores to provide feedback to managers. And I've got a sample from for you because it is a screenshot of a tool that, again, is available in Trakstar, but you could do this in Excel. And it is a distribution of the ratings of your managers. And you could split this by departments. You could split it by divisions. You could look at it by newer managers versus managers that have more tenure. But what you're looking for is you're looking for those patterns of managers that may need some feedback on how they're scoring people. If their scores are all way too high, you may need to talk with the manager about being more realistic. If the manager scores are way too low, you may need to talk with that manager about lightening up a little bit. One of the most important things you could do, if it was within your capability, is to actually compare the performance rating scores on average compared to department achievement. So if the department this last year has been killing it, like they're doing amazing things, but their performance rating scores are low, you can show a manager the disconnect between the two. Conversely, if a manager tells you, well, everyone deserves 5s, my team is working hard, yet the numbers for the team are not there, they're not achieving their goals, whatever they may be, it may be time to have a really hard conversation with the manager about how is it possible that all your people are performing so exceptionally, but the team's not meeting their goals. Either the goals are wrong or the performance is not correctly recognizing what's going on. So that's something to think about in terms of numbers. So a couple of kind of quick reminders, because we've talked about these all throughout the way, but best practices for your managers, the people actually doing the reviews. Gather employee feedback as a part of the process. 360 reviews are really popular. One of the reasons is because you're getting feedback from others that the person works with, but you're also getting it from the employee. And that's a really important way to make sure that you're having discussions, not just one-sided conversations. So have employees participate in rating their own feedback. Consider gathering feedback from others who are familiar with the employee's quality of work, especially if you're not necessarily around your employee all the time. This can be really important. Give the written review to the employee in advance of the conversation. I always advocate for this. Give it to them even a couple of days before, because you want them to read it and absorb it and be ready to have conversations. If you walk in and the employee doesn't know what's on the form, it's a little unsettling. Not only that, but it absolutely creates uneasiness for people. Most people dread performance review process even though they crave performance feedback. So by giving them everything that's in writing, it gives them an opportunity to digest that before they have to actually sit down and hear it. Set expectations about pay up front. We already talked about that. And hold your ground. Let's say you give the employee their review form in advance, and that employee decides to take a red pen to it and disagree with every point you've made. It doesn't mean that the employee can't document their own experiences or their own reactions to the feedback. But if you've been thoughtful in preparing your review, don't let an employee's kind of, I almost want to say, bulliness change your feedback. Because again, if you've been thoughtful about it, it doesn't mean that they don't have other points to make, but it means that you've taken time to document it. So be very careful to change, what you put in there, unless it legitimately is something that you learned was not correct. And a final kind of thought here, best practices for business owners or HR. You've got to teach managers how to give feedback, and it's a skill that we aren't born with, and most managers need to learn how to provide good feedback to employees. So make sure you're teaching managers how to give feedback. Teach managers how to deal with anger, tears, fear, and other emotions that may interrupt the process. Some managers are really good at this, and some kind of tend to fall apart. If somebody starts crying on them, they tend to kind of lose focus and sometimes even end the process. And that's actually the opposite of what we want to have happen. So teach managers how to deal with that. Hold managers accountable. Make sure that if you have a performance review process, that managers are doing the reviews and that they're doing them well. If they aren't, then they aren't performing their job, because their job is to make sure that work is getting done through others. Measure managers' effectiveness at feedback and evaluations. You know, talk with their employees, look at their average scores, rate them as managers, make that a part of their performance review process. And the final point here is consider the benefits of a focal review versus an anniversary review. For those of you who are debating what you're going to do with your performance review process, the focal review means you do all your reviews at the same time of year for all employees. Anniversary review means that you're doing reviews as people hit milestones, so either 30, 60, 90, or maybe a one-year mark. There are definite advantages and disadvantages to each, but you need to think through those a little bit. Obviously, anniversary reviews are good in that your managers aren't having to do them all at the same time, and hopefully they're very timely for the employee. Focal reviews are a little bit easier when you're trying to budget for increases and you're trying to do things relative to your budget. So consider those options, and I could probably speak for a whole hour about those advantages and disadvantages, but consider those options thoughtfully and do some research if you're thinking about starting a program from scratch. With that, I have gone up almost up until the last few minutes, but I did want to make sure if there were any questions that we let all of you ask those. And we also have another poll question. If you are interested in learning more about the services that Trakstar offers for automating your performance review process. And you don't have to feel any obligation. It's just an opportunity for you to let us know if you think that learning about their products and services would be helpful to you at this time. And if not, that's okay. We trust that in the future, if you find that it's going to be helpful to have that as a part of your process, that you can engage with Trakstar in the future. So we will go ahead and launch that poll. At the same time, we will address any questions from all of you that with our last few minutes that we have about the topics that we've talked about today.
Thank you so much, Stacy. That was great. It looks like we are actually going to send that out as a survey, so you guys will all get a quick survey at the close of the presentation.
Wonderful. So it looks like we have just one question that's come in here, and I don't know if you have others, Shauna. But the one question here is, how do you deal with a situation of a manager who is too hard on employees? And we kind of talked about that a little bit, about how different managers have different points of view. You know, some of them are really, overly generous, and some are kind of overly critical. And I think the best thing that you can do with that is some of the tips we talked about earlier, but standardizing the scoring a little bit so that that manager has a set of criteria instead of just using their own opinions about what different scores mean. And then also coaching that manager. You know, we all need coaching, and managers are no exception. So if you can find somebody that can provide that manager with some great coaching about ways to give effective feedback. And you don't necessarily want the person to always be giving positive feedback when it's not due, but you want them to understand the difference between positive reinforcement and almost positive criticism versus just, always being so harsh on the employees.
It looks like we got another great question in, and it's, do we have any written employee review forms or templates available?
Yeah. So there's quite a few samples if you search on the internet, and there's some sample forms. You know, the thing that I would suggest to people is that the more simple, the better. I have one client who literally, the performance review form says, highlight your 5 key successes from this past review period, and they actually do their reviews on a quarterly basis. So the employee will actually document their 5 key successes. They ask them to address 2 situations that they would have handled differently, and then they ask them to set goals for the coming quarter. So sometimes performance review forms can be as simple as that, just 3 sentences on a page. But there's also plenty of samples out there if you search, and you can find some samples of performance review forms.
That's great. And it looks like we got another question in. How often should we do an employee review?
Yeah, so I just mentioned that I have a client that's doing them quarterly, and that would be my preference. Now, sometimes when I say that, business owners or HR professionals say, oh my goodness, you're kidding me. I would say at a very, very minimum that you should be reviewing employees' performance annually, but it's really not ideal. If you can do it more frequently than that, it's better. So.
Perfect. Well, great questions. Thank you all for attending, and please visit us at akorww.bbb.org/webinar to register for our upcoming webinars. Next month, we're excited to have our own BBB services team presenting on the BBB dispute resolution process. If you've ever been curious about the BBB complaint process, this is the webinar for you. Lastly, we just want to thank Stacey and Trakstar, again, for the wonderful Shauna.Dutton at the BBB.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.